Okay, recording has started. Welcome to the March 7th edition of the study hall. As promised last time, as deferred last time, the topic for today is sentence correction problems that in some respect involve connecting punctuation and all of the topics that connect to that, including sentence structure and all that kind of good stuff. So we've already gone over rules here, so just to skip ahead to the actual content. These questions are multiple choice. As always, it is the GMAT. Here's where you answer multiple choice questions. You'll find underneath your name, you'll see this thing that looks like a lowercase a. If you expand that, if you click on that, you should see choices A through E. And if you pick one of those, then it will register. Please don't click it twice, because if you click twice, then your second click will undo your first one. If you want to change your answer, of course you can. Just make sure you click on the new answer choice, also exactly one time. And finally, I mean, there's only so much of an extent that we can enforce this, but make sure you remember that you are studying for a test on which there's no skipping of anything, and there's no leaving anything blank. Those are not options on test day. So if you're not answering these problems, there's very little that we can do about that here, but you're doing yourself a disservice as far as preparing for this exam, on which you're not allowed to do that. So basically answer all the problems. If you have to guess, you should get comfortable with the whole idea of I have to guess. It's a thing. We will encounter it on the test. So you want to make sure you're ready for that. All right, any questions before we get started on problems? If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the text box. And if not, then we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, it doesn't look like anybody's typing. So here is the first problem of the day. Sentence correction problem. All of these problems, by the way, come from either our exam database or the GMAT prep software. Here is a timer. Have fun. And remember where to find the multiple choice responses again, please. The multiple choice responses are, please don't type in the chat box. The multiple choice responses are underneath your name, under polling tools. So that would be right here. Go for it. Okay, so it looks like there's still a number of you who don't have answers to this yet. Remember how this test works. You got to pick something. So if you have to guess, go ahead and guess. Okay, we still got 4 non-responses if you are one of the non-responders. Again, make sure you pick something, even if it's a random guess. And remember where to find those choices. Okay, here are your class results. So it looks like we've got a decent majority. No, I guess not a majority. We've got a decent plurality in favor of E, but there is some support for other answers here. So keeping in mind what the theme of the day here is, let's take a look at the connecting punctuation first and see what it relates to. So by connecting punctuation, we're talking about all those punctuation marks that are not just commas, like things that are semicolons and colons and all that stuff. So here's a semicolon, here's a semicolon, here's a colon, here's a semicolon, and here's a colon. All right, so let's make sure that we are straight on how these things work. Can anybody tell me in the chat box, how does a semicolon work? What does it do? Yeah, a semicolon, which is that symbol, what it does is it connects two things that are basically independent sentences. So it connects a complete sentence to another complete sentence. It functionally wise, it's basically the same thing as a period, except for the fact that it implies some sort of relationship. In other words, the decision to use a semicolon rather than a period is like saying, oh, by the way, these two sentences, they have something to do with each other. So, but other than that, functionally, it's the same as a period, except in that it suggests a relationship between the two sentences. So that's the basic deal with a semicolon. So the things before and after it have to be sentences. So when you see a semicolon, it's not really an issue of connecting punctuation as much as it is of structure. Like you have to make sure that the things on either side of it are sentences. So let's look at what's in the choices with semicolons. So here we have birds, feathers, comma, a description, comma, serve various purposes. That's a sentence. Birds, feathers serve various purposes. On the other hand, the part that follows it, the part that follows the semicolon, is not a sentence. You just have some aiding in flight, others insulating their bodies. Remember that INGs are not verbs. So all of these things that are in red are just modifiers. So after the semicolon, you have not a sentence. So A, not a sentence after semicolon. Choice B, we've got, same thing with before the semicolon. We've got birds, feathers are outgrowths consisting of stuff. So that's a sentence. But then we have the same issue as in the other one, which is that these are just INGs again. There's no subject or verb this time. So definitely not a sentence. And then the only other choice with a semicolon is D. Let's take a look at that option. Still got the same issue, right? You've still got serving various purposes. That's not a sentence. It doesn't say these things serve various purposes. It's still a fragment. It's still a modifier that would have to be attached to a sentence. So A, B, and D all have the same problem. There may be other issues in these sentences, but remember the point here is to focus on one thing at a time. Also, when you guys study this stuff, make sure that your goal is not, oh, let me find absolutely everything that's wrong with this at once. Make sure your goal is, when you're studying, it's let me think about one topic at a time, primarily. That sort of concentration is what's going to get you guys to improve your skill set here. Someone says, how close is the relationship? It's not the kind of thing you would really want to try to make a formula for, because the test isn't going to get into that sort of rhetoric stuff. I mean, you'll be able to tell in context whether two ideas are related to each other or not. And remember that none of these problems will have more than one sentence anyway. So you're not going to have to, not something you'll have to deal with ever, because remember that you will not have more than one sentence. Right? If you had a period, you would, in the middle of it, that would be two sentences. They don't do that, because all of the sentence correction choices are single sentences. So on the GMAT, it's not an issue. If you're looking to improve your writing skill in general, that's another story, but this study hall is meant to be focused around things that the GMAT will actually test. All right, what about a colon? How does a colon work? You're welcome. How does a colon work? Send that chat box. Okay, functionally, yeah, it doesn't have to be a list, and yeah, it doesn't have to be a list. A lot of people are saying a list, not necessarily, but we'll get there. How does it work in terms of structure? So far, no one's talking about structure. People are talking about function. They're both issues. I don't know what an M dash is. Sorry, William. But not really. Dashes and colons are not the same, if that's a kind of dash. Okay. Some of you guys are saying clause and sentence, and that's pretty much on point here. The way the colon works is this. The colon has to be preceded by a complete sentence. Like a part of the sentence coming before the colon needs to be a complete sentence. So if you have something that's just a piece of a sentence, then that doesn't work. And I mean, you'll see informal instances of this, but it's not a thing. Like as an example of an incorrect use of a colon in this sense, if you say, this medication may have certain side effects, including a colon, A, B, and C, that's incorrect because this medication may have certain side effects, including is not a sentence. So yeah, I mean, true in that case, you can just get rid of the colon entirely. But the point is to understand that if you have this colon here, you're looking for a sentence. So we can look at that. It's okay in both of. It's not okay in both of these. If you look at C in this problem, C is not a sentence, the blue part. It's just birds, feathers, which are this and do this. So there's no verb there. I mean, you're still waiting to hear what birds, feathers do. You have birds, feathers, which are this and do that. Stop. Oops. It's kind of like my friend who is a sales manager and lives in Texas. Okay, well, we're still waiting to hear what my friend does. There's no verb. So that gets us down to E on the basis of sentence structure alone here, actually, because C, the part before the colon, is not a complete sentence. Okay, if you have any questions about that stuff, go ahead and type them in the text box. In the meantime, as far as this notion that the colon has to introduce a list, not really, and in fact, in most cases, it probably won't. But the point is that it has to introduce some kind of explanation or illustration or clarification. Like the part after, functionally the way it works, in other words, is that the part after the colon should illustrate, explain, or elaborate on the statement made before the colon. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be a list. In fact, in terms of explanations, it's usually not a list. I mean, as an example of that, if you have something like studies have shown that fruit is not as healthful as most people believe, colon, fruit sugar is entirely fructose, comma, a sugar that metabolizes quickly into fat stores if one is not exercising. So this is an example. I mean, you can have a sentence and then a colon and then a more specific thing that you can look at this as an explanation or as an illustration. It's like a way in which fruit is not as healthy as most people would think. Or it's an explanation of this claim. The claim is fruit is not as good for you as you think. Oh, and by the way, here's why. But you can have a list after the colon. I mean, whether you would call this a list is debatable, but I mean, it's a sentence and it's also a list. But you can also follow a colon with a list. That's also a thing. But it is not always like that. Could a semicolon work here? It wouldn't work as well from the standpoint of rhetoric, because what a colon communicates is different. Like, a colon actually communicates this specific type of relationship, where we're saying, like, more specifically, or by way of explanation, or let me give you an example. I mean, there's no reason, I suppose, that you couldn't use a semicolon there, but it would be less exact. I mean, if you have this kind of relationship, it's better to put a colon there because the colon specifically indicates that, whereas the semicolon is like any relationship at all. So you're not going to be forced to choose between two options like that because, again, neither one of them is strictly wrong. But since the colon is so much more of a specialized tool, if you are trying to do exactly what a colon does, the colon is more specialized. I think I might have said that backwards. Since the colon is such a specialized tool, if you are trying to do what the colon is designed to do, then it's better to use the colon. All right, any other questions about this problem? If not, then we can check out another one. I mean, let's look at the structure of the correct answer, too. I mean, we eliminated a bunch of stuff here and didn't really bother to look at the right answer. So make sure you understand how that works. Birds, feathers, comma, there's a description as a modifier, comma, serve various purposes. Colon, various purposes seems like it's begging for an explanation, and sure enough, there's an explanation. Some aid in flight, others insulate the birds' bodies, and still others offer bright displays for mating rituals. This whole sense of still others, if you're not a native speaker of English, you might not be super familiar with it. But it's like a way of saying, oh, there's even more kinds. It's like, here's what some of them do, here's what others do. And by the way, there's even more others, still others, besides that. It's like, oh, there's another category, whoa. That's kind of what that is. But you do have to have still in front of others. So if you have still in front of offering, that would be a totally different thing, because still offering means like they haven't stopped offering them yet. It's like the store is still offering a discount on this merchandise, meaning they haven't taken that away. It's not the meaning here. Nova, I don't remember what the positive means, so you're going to have to help me out here. What part of the sentence are you talking about? It doesn't say bird apostrophe S anywhere. Are you saying like if you put that in there? Like, are you saying if you substituted that for this? So this is birds plural, possessive. I mean, if you had a single bird, I mean, first of all, you would have to have a or the in front of it. You can't just say bird apostrophe S unless bird is someone's name. But in this context, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to use a single bird, because it's pretty clear from context that, like, across the range of birds, these are what feathers do, but they're not going to all do this in one bird. So at least, maybe not. It's more like thing about birds. Is the which in C correct usage? It's definitely not incorrect because it refers to feathers. And if you look at it side by side with this construction, then it's a little bit awkward. And remember that if you're going to judge things like wordy or awkward, you should always judge those as relative things. You should always, like nothing is awkward by itself on this test, but things can be more awkward or more wordy than another choice. So, which there's nothing wrong with that by itself, but if you look at this modifier next to it, this is done better. This is not as wordy for no reason. So, Jose, I actually explained the still offer part about 3 or 4 minutes ago. So if you didn't catch that, then it'll be on the recording. But yes, still offer is wrong because the short version is still offer would mean they were offering that and they hadn't stopped yet. Like, think about what it means. This store still offers 20% off on Saturdays. It's like that. It means they haven't stopped yet. Okay. All right. The short version of, so someone says, are colons and dashes interchangeable? The short answer is no, but if we see dashes in these later problems, then we'll talk about dashes. It would be a little bit weird to talk about them when they're not here. So let's try another one. There goes your answer choices. Try this one. So remember where your multiple choice answers are found. And here's a timer. Okay, so if you don't have an answer here, go ahead and pick something that is a thing, and then we'll take a look. Okay, so let's take a look at the structure and punctuation connecting these guys. Here is a graph of your results. So we've got a strong majority for B, although there seems to be even, if feeble, support for the other 4 choices. So let's take a look. Here's your connecting punctuation. Let's talk about what these things do. That's a semicolon. Those are dashes. And this is a semicolon. So we already talked about semicolons. As far as what dashes do, dashes are very versatile. They can do a number of things. So if you have issues with dashes, perhaps the best thing to think about is just that if you don't know whether a dash can do something, it probably can. So that's the first observation. That sounds like a snarky statement, but it's not really. I mean, dashes are very, very versatile. So basically, if you aren't sure whether a dash can do something, it probably can. So let me give you a sense of the main jobs that dashes do here. Well, one thing they do is, what can dashes do? One thing they can do is they can set off modifiers in much the same way that commas do. So they can set off modifiers like commas do, as commas do. Those You want to have a reason for that, though. Like if you have a dash that just substitutes for a comma, there's usually a reason. So if commas are replaced with dashes, it's usually because of either emphasis, surprise, or irony in what is described. So here's a couple of examples to make clear what I'm saying here. Like if you, so San Francisco, for example, is a lot colder than Miami. So if somebody from Miami thought that San Francisco was cold, then that would not surprise anybody. So like John, comma, who grew up in Miami, comma, thinks that San Francisco is unbearably cold. So there's no surprise there, so we just have commas. On the other hand, Minnesota is a lot colder than San Francisco. So if John were from Minnesota and believed the same thing, it would be a little bit weird. So if you took that sentence and you had instead this John guy is from Minnesota, so we'll edit that to say. Then with commas there, it doesn't make a lot of sense because you're not capturing the essence of the surprise here. So what you would do in that instance is you would replace those commas with dashes. You have to either go all in or all out, meaning that you cannot replace one of the commas with a dash but not the other one. So you can't block off a modifier with one dash and one comma. It's exactly like commas, where if it's in the middle of stuff, you need to have one in front and in back. But if it's on one of the ends, then you just have it on the other end. So that's one thing dashes can do. They don't always have to appear in pairs, just like commas don't. I mean, if you say, here are two examples, like my brother, comma, a sales manager, comma, likes negotiations, versus, you know, how should one negotiate this? You should ask your brother, comma, a sales manager. So, I mean, this is the same modifier, but the point is, like, if it's in the middle of stuff, then you're going to have commas on both sides of it. But if it's not in the middle of stuff, then you're not. I mean, you clearly can't put a comma after manager here because the sentence ends at that point. So, in that case, you just have this. I mean, dashes are the same. If the thing that you are dashing off extends all the way to the end of the sentence, then you are all good. You couldn't close that off. So hopefully that is clear. If not, go ahead and post. Let's take a look at what else dashes can do. What dashes can also do, okay, I mean, another thing they can do is they can clarify what is a modifier in cases in which commas would be ambiguous. So if you say something like this, 3 of my friends, Clark, Tom, Dale, and their wives came to the party. I mean, we don't know what this means, right? This could mean it was 3 of my friends, and then these guys named Clark, Tom, and Dale, and their wives. Or that these could actually be my friends' names. We don't really know, because the commas there could work either way. So, 3 of my friends, on the other hand, 3 of my friends, dash, Clark, Tom, and Dale, and their wives came to the party. Then there's no ambiguity here. If you have this sentence, then it is absolutely unambiguous that these 3 names are my 3 friends. And so 6 people came to the party. Double dash, like this is not really a double dash, but when you type dashes are longer and they're not on the standard keyboard. So when you type that, it's usually typed as 2 hyphens in a row. Like 2 hyphens in a row is a dash. Paulina, you could do that. You would need a reason to emphasize Clark. If there was some sort of element like this, then that if there's this kind of element, then you could. So if Clark doesn't usually go out much, then you could do that. Like, oh, one of my friends, who, by the way, was Clark, whoa, surprise, and his wife came to the party, then that would make sense. So, David, no, but we'll talk about structure in a second here. And the last thing that dashes can do is it can actually set off, they can actually set off complete sentences as descriptions of stuff. So they can set off complete sentences as descriptions. Commas can't do that. So as an example of this, Los Angeles is a city where fashion does not follow function. You will see people walking down the street in midsummer in anything from short shorts to shearling fur. If you don't know what shearling is, it's something you would not normally wear unless it was cold. Unlike its counterparts with more severe climates, like New York, such as New York City. So, in this case, you will see people walking down the street in midsummer in anything from this to this. That's a sentence. So you definitely could not put commas around that, because then you would have the run-on of the year. But with dashes, you can do that. You can actually set off entire sentences as explanations of things. So, and this is I can't cite OG problems here, but there's one of the new problems in the 13th edition it's about heirloom tomatoes, like a particular kind of tomato, and in the correct answer, you got a whole sentence set off by a dash. I don't remember what it's. I think it's a pair of dashes, but it's equivalent, right? But you have a whole sentence that's set off by this. So okay. On the other hand, the thing that is set off by the dash does have to be a thing. Like it either has to be a modifier or it has to be a sentence. It can't be a fragment of a sentence. So in terms of, who asked that question? David, your sentence isn't going to work because, just briefly, because the part after the dash is not an element. It's not a thing, for lack of a better term. It's not a grammatical element. Like if you're looking at this sentence, the problem is that this is not a sentence. So it's structurally not okay, because that's not a modifier, but it's also not a sentence. It's just like a verb, and then some stuff that follows the verb. It also does. This sentence also wouldn't make a ton of rhetorical sense either, because it doesn't work the right way. You're not like, the part that he thinks San Francisco is cold shouldn't be a modifier because that's the main part of the sentence. So it should be structured like this one, where the main thought, which manifests as the main sentence, is John thinks that San Francisco is really cold. That's the main thought. And then, oh, by the way, so ironically, here's where John grew up. That's a side thought. So if you reverse these two thoughts, you would wind up with a sentence that didn't make a ton of rhetorical sense. So, yeah. Okay, so that's what dashes can do. So let's talk about this sentence now. Now that we got all that. So, Shail, yes, you can, although I don't know whether GMAC would approve. I mean, in normal writing, absolutely, yes, you can do that. But on the GMAT, I just don't think they would give you the option of that. So, okay. Let's see. Because, I mean, yeah, the sentence you wrote there would totally be a thing. Like, if you were writing a book explaining how dashes work, you could definitely write that. But whether that is a thing that whether that would get GMAC's approbation is a whole different story. So, okay, now let's talk about these examples. Let's take this over to another page because we don't really have any room. Okay. So first of all, let's make sure we understand what is going on in the sentence. The first thing should always be meaning, right? So the meaning of the sentence is that all of the Russian railway stations, like the time at all of the stations, is in the Moscow time zone. That's not that remarkable until you get to this thought that this is even true in places that are 8 time zones away. So, surprisingly, this is even true in places like Magadan, which is 8 time zones away. So that's the meaning here. And you want to have modifiers that do this. So let's take a look. First, you have your semicolons. That's like last time. You need to have sentence, semicolon, other sentence. So here's a semicolon. In choice A, okay, timetables, blah, 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 use Moscow time. That's a sentence. And then even those located in these places are there. That's also a sentence. It's got some issues, which we'll get to later, but it's not ungrammatical. On the other hand, if you go down to E, this is a sentence, but the part to the right of the semicolon is not a sentence. This is just a thing. This is a modifier. So can't do that after a semicolon. So this is not grammatical. Now, on the other hand, the dash. So remember what we said dashes can do. I mean, they're still setting off things that are modifiers or descriptions. At least in the usage that if Shail's usage in the chat box is a thing, then that's a different type of usage. But in everything we've seen in these GMAC sources, it's used for descriptions or explanations or illustrations or blah, blah, blah. So we need to make sure that we are describing the stuff we want to describe. Like what is this? What does that refer to right there? What are those? So those are the stations. That means that's good placement. It's right after the stations, so there's no lack of clarity as to what is going on there. Right? That's this. On the other hand, if you look at the version that's in choice D, it's not done as well as that is, because that makes it look like timetables are locations. It's unnecessarily far away from railway stations. Is unnecessarily far away. And again, remember, when you're talking about modifier placement, you should, that's also a comparative thing. It's kind of like wordiness, where you're not absolutely looking for like, where is the best place to put this modifier. I mean, if there is a clear best place, then great. But for the most part, you're just looking at the choices that are there and asking yourself which one of these choices puts the modifier in a place that actually makes sense. So if you are looking at B and D here, then it's clear that B is doing a better job of placement than D is. So we can get rid of D. Now, as far as A and C goes, what's the problem with A? Can anybody tell me in the chat box? Remember, it's not a grammatical problem, because the grammar of choice A is totally impeccable. So what's meaning, right? That's all that's left. But what in particular, what? What sort of, it is a meaning error. What is the meaning error? People who are saying things like missing this or not a complete sentence, let me reiterate, there are no grammatical problems in choice A. So that's not a joke. Like, it is a complete sentence. There are no missing elements. That's not the problem. So the problem is in terms of what it means. There's two issues in terms of meaning here. The first in choice A, I mean, yeah, the first one is that timetables can't use a time zone, because people can, but timetables can't. People can use a time zone for timetables. A time zone can be used for timetables, but not. Timetables themselves don't get up and use a time zone. So, two meaning issues with A. The first is that timetables use Moscow time. It doesn't make sense. Versus if you look at B, this does make sense. I mean, it's passive voice, which it really should be, because the people using it are clearly not the point here. So it's better to not mention those people, and that's the passive is how you do that. So this time is used for all these timetables. The other issue is that this is not related back to this idea. You've got a semicolon where it sounds like it's two separate thoughts. So it sounds like thought number one is that the time zone is Moscow time everywhere. But that thought number two is, oh, by the way, also, some places are very far away. It's not a clear reference. Like you're not saying what you're supposed to be saying, which is, even though which is, you know, like even including those railway stations that are that far away. So the semicolon doesn't capture capture which thoughts are separate and which aren't. To put it in simpler terms, that sentence is basically saying, you know, they use Moscow time everywhere. Semicolon. Some of the stations are very far away. I mean, you can kind of piece together what the intention here is, but there's clearly a missing direct connection. Like you want to be saying like what B says. where they use it at all of the stations, dash, even the stations that are like a million trillion miles away. How can thought number 2 be a complete sentence? Well, because those is the subject. So even those in these parts are this far away. If you wanted a correct sentence that would have this kind of construction, most of the students here, let me put the question up on the board. Okay, there's the question. I mean, the best answer I've got to that is it just can. But here's another example. Like if you say most of the cadets failed the physical fitness test, semicolon, even those who passed it were not in terribly great shape. So this is a sentence. It's like saying even those guys were not, the ones who passed it. Like here's your subject, and it's described by who passed it, and here's your verb. So that's a sentence. Someone is asking what type of modifier. I guess I don't really understand what you're asking. If you're asking for terminology, I have absolutely no idea what just about any of these things are called. I'm not really a terminology guy. So the only terms that I know are things like subject and verb and like super basic things like that. But I would also encourage you to not worry about what things are called. You just have to know how to use them. So, all right, other questions? Yeah, any of the sentences that say the timetables use this time zone is a meaning problem. I mean, you've got, because they don't. I mean, if you had to say someone uses the time zone, you would have to say it's like the people who make timetables. So that's problematic. The timetables use it. Well, not really. And the timetables don't use. So, all right. Okay. GMAT secrets, I don't understand what you're asking me. Why? I mean, if you, if you don't understand why this second part is not a sentence, it's not something that, I mean, that's actually a pretty basic idea. So make sure that you go back to the book or some sort of source where you look at what a sentence looks like. A subject and a verb and stuff. Like, I hit the ball, the dog ran. So you can't say, even in places like this, period. It's not a sentence. This would have to be stuck on to something. But you should make sure that you can identify what is a sentence and what is not from just looking at it. So if it's not clear to you why that's not a sentence, you should go back to the basics and familiarize yourself with what is a sentence and what isn't a sentence. So, okay, wow, there's so many questions. Let's see. In the Shail, this is not a half a thought. This is a complete sentence. Even those guys were not in good shape. These are both complete sentences. I mean, those can also be a noun that means those. It can also be a pronoun that means those guys. So, and you can stick even in front of, again, a surprising case of something. Like even Joe came to the restaurant last night. If Joe doesn't usually go to restaurants. The east from and east of here is just meant to distract you. Remember that the current GMAT is not really about idioms like that. So if you don't know those, it's not a big deal. And okay, after Magadan, shouldn't there be a which? No, in fact, Sandeep, it's better if you don't have one, because then it's more compact while expressing the same idea. Like if you look at this other problem here that we saw, this one, same sort of thing here. Like if you have birds, feathers, comma, description, comma, as in the correct answer here. That's better than saying birds, feathers, which are blah, 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 because these words are not necessary. Again, it's not an error to have these here, but you don't need them for any reason, and it's better to not have them as a result. So same sort of thing here. 8 time zones east of Moscow describes where Magadan is. So this is perfectly fine by itself. It would not be wrong if you put which there. Like Magadan, which is 8 time zones east of Moscow. That would work too. But this is a thing. Okay. Let's see. What is the fast method? That's not really the point right now. The point is to learn how these constructions work. So right now we don't care about fast. And I mean more generally in terms of learning as a whole, make sure you know that this is not a good way to think until you are done learning. So what I mean by that is when someone is saying, what is the fast method? Remember, this is not just a GMAT thing, too. This is like all human learning. I mean, remember that you can't simultaneously learn new things and get faster. That's not a thing. It's impossible. So it's kind of common sense that that's impossible. But again, when it comes to these tasks, people don't bring as much common sense to the table as sometimes they should. So meaning, as an analogy, if you're a dancer, you can do one of two things. You can either try to learn new dance steps or try to get faster at the dance steps that you already know how to do. But you can't simultaneously learn a new step and get faster. That's not a thing. It has to be one or the other. So same sort of thing here. If your goal is to learn how these constructions work, then even if it's really slow, who cares? Whereas if your goal is to speed it up, then you should specifically stop trying to learn things and work with the information that you do understand. Okay. Let's see. I think that covers the questions that are there. Okay. Let's see. You're welcome. We had GMAT study hall, aka Thursdays. I mean, headings are a totally different art. The GMAT, needless to say, the GMAT does not test headings, so this is a GMAT study hall. Let's just stay on topic here. All right, one more problem, and then we will probably be out of time. So try this. Seem to be a lot of problems about Siberia today. All right, give it a shot. Again, your multiple choice options are there. Okay, so if you don't have an answer, please pick one. Remember that the name of the game is pick something. If you're not responding, then it's questionable whether you're preparing for this test versus some other amorphous task here. But okay, so let's take a look at what happened here. So we've got, here's the class responses. So the correct answer is one of those bigger spikes, but let's take a look. And again, if you are one of the 4 non-responders, where, I mean, the 5th one is me, so if you're one of the 4 non-responders, you know what's up. You should definitely pick a response. So let's take a look. So connecting punctuation again. Well, here's a semicolon. And they all have semicolons. This one's got one here. So let's see how these do. All right. Well, the Valley of Oymyakon is Earth's coldest place. Cold. That's a sentence. So no issues there. And if you put this as a modifier after it, it's still a sentence. And then afterwards, you've got this happens, and many residents lacking plumbing have to use outdoor toilets. Okay, so that's a sentence. Same thing, nevertheless, many residents, and then here's a description of their situation, and then must use outdoor toilets, so we're fine. With this happening, many residents lack plumbing, so must use. That's not a sentence. It doesn't have to do with the semicolon, but remember that so in this kind of usage is basically an adverb, or it connects 2 sentences, one of those 2 things. So like, here's how so works. I don't really know how you would grammatically classify it, but there's 2 ways you can do it. The first way you can use it is to actually connect 2 sentences, like a truck just overturned on the freeway. So we are going to be over an hour late. Notice that this is a sentence and that this is another sentence. So you can use so to do that. That doesn't happen in choice C because must use outdoor toilets is not a sentence. Or you can just use it as an adverb, meaning it doesn't really grammatically do anything at all. Like if you've got, if you have a sentence like, I am stuck behind an overturned truck, and so will be late to work. I mean, in this case, so is playing an important role in terms of meaning, but it's an adverb. It's describing will be late, so you can take it out and you still have a sentence. Like if you say, I am stuck behind the truck and will be late to work, that's totally still a sentence. And the so here is just elaborating on the causal relationship. So, but that doesn't happen here either. Like if you say many residents lack plumbing and so must use outdoor toilets, that would be a sentence because of the and. But not without it. In other words, this is a sentence. And so when you throw so in there, it's still a sentence. So C doesn't work either way with that. You really shouldn't worry about sounds awkward. I mean, you're either going to have, if you have, I mean, that's one of those things where if you have to ask, then don't think about it. I mean, if awkwardness is not an instinct, then, you know, it's kind of like asking whether something is like obvious. Like if you have to ask whether it's obvious, it means it's not obvious. It's like that. Yeah, if you have to ask whether it's awkward, then don't even go there. Is the best way to deal with that. GMAT secrets, the short answer is no. The long answer is that you don't. This whole idea that you have to have a comma between two sentences is not really true. But that's we can go into that at the end if there's a couple of minutes. All right. So now, what about these last two, structure-wise? Someone tell me, what does nevertheless do? What is that? Okay, that's what it does functionally, but how does it work in terms of structure? Like, can you use it the way that it's being used in D and E? So the answer is no, you can't. Paulina, I don't remember the terms that you're using, but I think you have the right idea, which is that it makes it a sentence that's a run-on. It makes it not a sentence. So if you say, like, the point is that nevertheless is just an adverb, meaning that grammatically it plays no role at all. I mean, it can play a very, very important role in terms of the meaning of the sentence, because in terms of meaning, nevertheless is like this contrast thing. It's minus 60 Celsius outside, which if you're a Fahrenheit person is like minus 71. Nevertheless, people are still going to the bathroom outside. Wow. So, but in terms of the way the sentence works, the sentences have to work the same way as they would without it. So if you said something like Gabriel was granted extra time, but nevertheless was unable to finish the exam. So this sentence, I mean, nevertheless, if you don't have it in there, it's still a grammatical sentence. Like if you remove that, you get Gabriel was granted extra time, but was unable to finish the exam. Still a sentence. It's kind of like so in this example. It's exactly the same as that. So let's connect those together. So the upshot, except nevertheless can only do that. Nevertheless doesn't have this other option like so does. Like you cannot use nevertheless, or however for that matter, to stick two sentences together. That's not a thing. You can't do that. So like in D, you wind up with many residents lack plumbing, comma, they have to use outdoor toilets. That's a run-on. That's two sentences glued to each other. That's not legit. Same thing, temperatures drop regularly below this value, comma, many residents don't have plumbing. Okay, you got another run-on. There's no connector. Because nevertheless is not a connector. I mean, it can connect ideas, but it absolutely cannot link together two clauses all by itself. So hopefully that makes sense. So in terms of structure, I mean, if you're considering the comma as a piece of connecting punctuation, then this is also under the umbrella of connecting punctuation. I mean, adverbs are adverbs. They don't serve grammatical roles. So if you take an adverb out, you have to have a sentence that still works. So there's your answer to that, because you can't have necessary connectors that can be taken out. Okay, so as a more general point, make sure that you guys understand both aspects of whatever constructions you learn. Like when you learn a new construction, make sure you focus on both its meaning or significance in the sentence, and its structure or grammatical role. Because these are both things. And I mean, what's interesting, like what I'm noticing is that most of you guys seem to just be paying attention to exactly one of these two things each time. And it's even more interesting is that it's not always the same one. Like if I ask the class, hey class, how do you use a semicolon? Basically everybody will tell me, oh, complete sentence before and after. And nobody will go to the whole there should be a relationship thing. But then when I say how does nevertheless work, even when I say in terms of structure, the whole class is suddenly only talking about this. The whole class is just talking about it, indicates some contrast. And there's a total neglect of what it does and does not do grammatically. So like make sure that you are paying attention to both. Like whenever you encounter a new thing that you don't know how to use, there's two issues. The first issue is what does it do, or what is it meant to do? And the second is how does it do it? How does it work? Make sure you look at both, because that's sorely lacking in a lot of people's approach to this kind of stuff. So, all right, now let's talk about the meaning of the sentence overall. I mean, so we know that there's supposed to be a contrast between oymyakon is really cold and something. So the question is, which of the following makes the most sense? Which there's three options here. The first option is oymyakon is very cold. Nevertheless, temperatures go below -60 all the time. The second is oymyakon is really cold. Nevertheless, people still have to go to the bathroom outside. And then the third one is oymyakon is really cold. Nevertheless, people there don't have plumbing. I mean, only one of these makes any sense, which is the one in the middle, because the other two are not contrast. So, I mean, there's no contrast between, I mean, there's obviously no contrast between being cold and having temperatures that are low. Like, this would be a reinforcing idea. But then the last one, there's just not a relationship at all. I mean, not having plumbing is more like a lack of infrastructure or maybe wealth, but it's certainly not a weather thing. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily expect cold weather places to have plumbing any more than you would expect hot weather places to have it. So, not really a relationship. So, we want the one in the middle, which is the only one here that does make sense. It's really cold, but whoa, people are still going to the bathroom outside in the cold. So like this should be the structure of the sentence that you have. Like in terms of meaning, the nevertheless should, in fact must. The nevertheless absolutely must divide these two ideas. So if nevertheless doesn't connect those two ideas, it won't make sense. Sentence won't make sense unless nevertheless links these two ideas. So like let's see what nevertheless links up here. Well, in A you've got oymyakon is cold, nevertheless temperatures drop below this value. That's number one there. That doesn't make sense. That's not a contrast. Choice B, oymyakon is very cold, blah, 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 semicolon. Nevertheless, many residents, modifier, have to use outdoor toilets. This is the meaning that we want. Choice C, oymyakon is very cold, nevertheless, modifier, many residents don't have plumbing. That's not logical. D, you've got oymyakon is cold, these two don't make sense linked to each other either. Temperatures get this low and people don't have plumbing, comma, nevertheless. So you do have this idea after nevertheless, but putting these two ideas together, because these are not bullet points. These are not ideas that should be A and B, so that doesn't make sense either. And then finally, Oymyakon is very cold. Temperatures get this cold. Nevertheless, again, you've got the problem of nevertheless, people don't have plumbing. That's not a thing that makes sense either. So in terms of meaning, it's actually just B that has the structure that we want. And if you think about what the intention of the sentence is, before you start going crazy with it, then it's a little bit easier to do that. Okay, we got to start winding down here a little bit. But let me, let's see. I think I can find a link for one of the questions you guys are asking here. Hold on a sec. Okay. All right. So to the person asking about this, let me find that question. Yeah, it's that question, the one about the comma. So the reason why the third option is wrong here is that it doesn't make sense. The third option is structured like this. That's not a thing. There's no contrast there between. There's no contrast between really cold weather and lack of plumbing. Like, this is not something that would be unexpected in cold places, whereas that is. It's really cold there. You would not expect people to have to go to the bathroom outside, but they do. Nevertheless, they still do. No relationship here like that. Just think about that from a not academic point of view. Think about it from a real world standpoint. These would be two totally separate observations with nothing to do with each other. Whereas these would be two observations that are very surprising together. And that's what nevertheless is. Okay, this question, all right, here's a link. You can go read all about it. So I just put a link in the chat box. That won't be preserved, I don't think, so you should click that link now and just leave that page open or bookmark it or something. So, but the main point is you don't ever have to even worry about that. But that post explains why. Okay. Meaning that the link won't be available. And I'm not sure whether the link will be available in the recording. It may or may not. Yeah, okay, we gotta wrap up here in a couple of minutes. I mean, a couple of comments on these questions. Like, the thing with this kind of question is that this is not the kind of question that any native speaker is gonna be able to answer, because that's not what understanding a language is like. You know, I mean, imagine in your own native language if somebody asked you a question like this. Like if someone asked you, I don't know, like, what are all the verbs that do this? Well, that's only a thing you would be aware of if you had learned the language as a foreign speaker. So, I mean, as someone who has spoken English since I was a small child, there's no way I could answer a question like this. I mean, if you asked me about a particular word, I could tell you how to use it, but the only people who would ever have learned lists of words would be people who didn't grow up with English. So, but the point is, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, just do the problems, and if you encounter these words, then worry about how they work. And if you don't, then don't. That's the best way to do it. Let's see, is there anything else? Maria, the GMAT doesn't test the difference between modifiers with commas and modifiers without commas, so not worth going into, but as long as you recognize that, this is a modifier. I mean, there would be a meaning difference, but it's not, the GMAT will not test that, so it's not worth complicating the issue with that idea. I mean, as long as you know that this is a modifier and that it looks like this and that it can look like this, then that's all you need here. So commas around a modifier versus not won't be tested. All right, we gotta run. I'm gonna kill the recording at this point. Thank you for watching. And I believe the next session is 2 weeks from now. There might be an extra week for Easter week. There might not. I'll check the calendar. But the next session will be posted on the same webpage, as always. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off. And thank you, and good night, and good luck.